Welcome, Gabriel. This is the first recording that I'm doing for the Biz podcast. And the goal for this podcast series is basically that I saw so many people doing different podcasts, for Bitcoin. It seems like super saturated and everybody has like the same like cool new guest on. Like they do like 3 shows and you get all this barrage of the same guy for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And I was like, all right, what can I do different? What could be useful in a little bit of a different angle? So what I'm trying to do is have people on this show that are experienced in the business side of the industry that can share unique experiences with the learnings that they have from actually working in this industry. And I knew that for sure lawyers would be a good type of person to have on the show. And so when I thought of lawyers, you're pretty much the only one I have a decent relationship with, because some lawyers are, I know like Santori and these guys from years back, but they're just not the kind of guy that I want to have on this show. But I think that we probably have a lot in common, and hopefully we can have a good time today. Have some cool info that we can share with Bitcoiners and I guess maybe crypto people alike, since that's a little bit more your realm as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
Maybe you want to tell us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, why Bitcoiners should care about what you say.
Yeah, sure, totally. So, basically, I was a very traditional corporate lawyer by training and experience for about 8 years. So I worked in the really big Wall Street firms, Am Law 20 firms, doing buy-side M&A for tech companies like Facebook and Oracle and eBay and that sort of thing. And in the course of doing that, I started to learn a lot about issues around encryption and privacy, and a lot of the not so much money. I got into that later, and I know that's a big thing for Bitcoin. But some of the other sort of cypherpunk issues, that a lot of people care about, and strong encryption especially. So through that, I sort of got red pilled initially into Ethereum. Right. And my first Ethereum event, oddly enough, was an Ethereum meetup where Nick Szabo was the first speaker, or the main speaker, which is basically inconceivable now. Right. There's like so much antipathy. But, back in early 2016, that was like a normal and fine thing. And that was ideal for me. Right. Because I wasn't super technical, but I knew a lot about law, and he spoke about both. And from there, I was really hooked. And so I just kept it up as an interest while continuing my normal M&A practice. And in sort of early 2018, literally days after I was finally kind of put officially on the partner track at my firm, which, would have been a lot of money and glamour and big deals and that sort of thing, I just decided, no, I just got to quit and go full crypto. And, I've been doing that in one form or another since then.
Yeah, I've been like watching all of the whole lexicon of episodes of Suits lately, so I'm also just as much an expert as you now.
Excellent. That's all you need.
So you mentioned that you came into this through the Ethereum side. Do you also have clients and have experience doing things that are specific to the Bitcoin side, or is it just more general? Like, what can you say about that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've had, definitely the main part of my actual client work has been within the Ethereum ecosystem, but over time, I have personally just gotten a lot more interested in Bitcoin, which has been interesting because it's sort of run. I was like an Ethereum maximalist back in early 2016 when it was less cool than it is now. And then by the time it became cool, I had already become like very sympathetic to Bitcoin, and thought that Bitcoin is sort of the best for the hard money type of use case. And, thinking that Ethereum should not try to be that, right? And at the very same time I was coming to that conclusion, a bunch of others were starting the ETH is money movement. So it's been interesting, but I have a lot of affection for both ecosystems basically. And, I guess maybe I'm a little bit of an outlier in that regard.
What do you think that like Bitcoiners have wrong about Ethereum people and Ethereum people have wrong about Bitcoiners?
Well, I'll start with the second one. So I think that what most Ethereum people miss about Bitcoin is that it's not just about the technology, right? The Ethereum people are just so super focused on the tech and the code itself. And I just think they think a lot less about the social layer. And whereas Bitcoin benefited from having the early, cypherpunks like Nick Szabo and many of these others, Hal Finney, involved early on. And I think that they established a direction where trust minimization on the social layer is extremely important. As a result of that, there is really an enormous social firewall in Bitcoin, which first became clear to me when the UASF happened, and has sort of continued since then, I think, as a theme and as a key selling point for Bitcoin. Whereas Ethereum is, as a culture, is much more, they like leaders and figureheads a lot more. And on a social level, it's very strange because, a lot of them will openly talk about trusting people and community and values and this sort of thing. And I think that's just very foreign to Bitcoiners, who are more about not trusting anyone, trying to have no governance, so there's no coercion, and so on. So it's different models, and I think Ethereans miss how valuable that social layer trust minimization is. As for what Bitcoiners miss about Ethereum, I think that it's that a lot of the experiments and the innovation that happen technologically, even though they might not start out as totally trust minimized, are actually very cool ideas, and with some patience, they could evolve into something that is more robustly trust minimized across the board. It just needs more time and more thinking and more work. And I think the Bitcoiners just sort of think, oh, it's a scam. It's just all a scam because there's a token, and it's not going to work because it has this and that trust hole. But I think that's a little bit too harsh and too pessimistic. So that's what I would say the two communities miss about each other.
Yeah, I feel like there's even maybe still something lost in between among both communities, and that, like, if you could just put them all and combine them, and have certain amount of open-mindedness in Bitcoin, or rethinking certain aspects of what we're so staunch about, and maybe how we could maybe do some of the magical things that Ethereum claims to do, but on Bitcoin, that we would have maybe a better, more creative product creation aspect of the community, and
Yeah.
maybe we'd be trying to do a better job at I guess digitizing trust and making it something that's more workable. And I kind of see that as I can see Ethereum trying to do that with things like DAOs and things like this, which I know you're also really into and have projects that you're related to with DAOs. I guess what it is, and I guess I'm ranting a bit, but for Bitcoiners, it's really hard because we just see the Ethereum base layer as a design flaw from the start. And so it's like you're just kind of, I always say, it's like you're building sandcastles and trying to sell them as property,
Right.
And so that's really hard for Bitcoiners to get past. And then, Ethereum guys just want to say, oh, well, but we look at all this complexity that we can achieve. Look at all of these tricks we can do. And, it all expresses normally as scams, or as inefficiencies that are ultimately being, arbed out inside of these complex mechanisms, and you wonder who the real use cases are at all.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think you put it very well, and I think the key thing though is that Ethereum provides more of a devsumer platform. And that's going to attract experiments that, whether they're built on Ethereum 1.0 or Ethereum 2.0, there should eventually be some architecture that is good for this type of thing. And in the meantime, people are exploring it a lot because it's easy to hack on, right? It's harder to hack on Bitcoin, from what I understand, right? So I did I see both sides of it basically, but yeah.
Yeah, it's been something that Bitcoiners have been kind of expressing jealousy about for years now. The fact that Ethereum has captured the hearts and minds of young devs,
Yep.
and how to do a better job cultivating devs. I mean, Bitcoin core development has definitely grown over the years, but I do think we've stagnated on the product side. And shameless plug, that's something I'm trying to make better with the stealth mode company I'm doing as well, with trying to focus more on use cases on top of Bitcoin on layers, instead of just stuff with finance and that kind of thing. So yeah, with this kind of divide, it does ultimately boil down to centralization and decentralization, and that kind of being a core of why Bitcoiners are critical. So how do you rationalize the ability for things to actually become meaningfully decentralized if like it just stays so complex?
Right. There's, yeah, it's an issue. I mean, I think everything is just about trust assumptions, right? It's on a continuum. Bitcoin, because it has successfully kept block sizes small, and has made it a priority to have, ease of running nodes on consumer hardware. That's a really powerful form of decentralization, and that makes it, for example, I would say more robust against sovereign attacks. Right, because if a sovereign goes after big mining operations, well, that would suck for a little while, but the difficulty would adjust down, and you probably would have a lot of people step up, and start running more consumer hardware, and so on. But with the state in Ethereum, the data being very heavy, right? Naturally, it's going to be a heavier load on nodes. And I think, I'm not familiar with sort of every twist and turn, of the latest thinking on, the proof of stake version of Ethereum. But it sounds to me like that is very likely to turn into sort of a professionalized node operation as well, right? Because just the requirements are very heavy, and it's very complex, and you can get slashed, and so on and so forth. And probably what most people will do is just stake with Coinbase, right? Because it's going to be easy to stake with Coinbase. So I do worry about that. But on the other hand, it's all just different models and trust assumptions, and probably either one is still better, than this hegemony of big tech companies, and just relying on their servers, and having something like the Twitter hack, where someone just gets the God mode privilege and suddenly has access to everyone's accounts. So I guess I'm just not an absolutist about it. There are degrees, but people should be clear and honest about what the risks are, and not just use the word decentralization as a big hand wavy thing, because equating the decentralization of one system to another in one dimension might not be very good, but you're using the same word for both, and there also are multiple dimensions. So one could be decentralized at the tech layer, but not very decentralized at the social layer, and so on. So the nuances matter.
Yeah, I actually think that a lot of what you just said is probably a good segue to ask more about the relationship of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies with government agencies. We recently had that CFTC rep call Bitcoin a one-trick pony and talk about,
Right.
Ethereum is the internet and Bitcoin is email. And, of course, all the Bitcoiners were very upset and all the Ethereum guys were thrilled. And, but this brings me to one of my thinking. I feel like how it's going to play out is Ethereum will become like the state-aligned coin. And that will provide it a certain amount of actual protection in a weird way that Bitcoin doesn't have. And it could, and so far as how this kind of thing is expressed is in providing Ethereum a lot easier funding and a lot more, like these young devs and all these VC companies that get involved with altcoin startups and things like this, where they kind of neglect a lot of Bitcoin startups and investment opportunities. So what do you think? What do you think about what the CFTC rep said, first of all? And then I want to talk a little bit more about other agency relationships.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, what he said was shocking to me, right? Because if you look at the DeFi stuff, I can find a lot of good arguments that a lot of the DeFi things violate commodities rules, right? Now, I think I'm not saying I don't think the CFTC should come in and just drop the hammer on all of it, because it's sort of interestingly different from the original scenarios that probably people had in mind with those laws. But I wouldn't be, if I were him, I would have been more like Jay Clayton was in 2017. I would have been, this is my concern face and we're looking into it, but people should tread carefully, because his job is to enforce these laws, right? And they're arguably being violated. So I was very surprised by that. I think part of the reason for, I don't think there's something of like Ethereum is state aligned. I mean, no one really represents Ethereum, but there is a similar higher order effect from the fact that Ethereum projects just have a greater need of lawyers because of the added complexity. They're doing things that arguably are derivatives, are swaps, arguably are securities, and that sort of thing, right? And whereas there's just less of that in Bitcoin, so there's just a greater need for them to be concerned with legal and regulation. Therefore, they talk to them more, right? Therefore, the regulators see more of that, understand it better, and get the pitch of what Ethereum is from people who are holding a lot of ETH and have a lot of investments in that ecosystem. And I do think that probably does lead to some distortion. But on the other hand, I would say on the good news side, at least from what the Bitcoin, community is currently doing, I just think it has a lot less need of laws because it's sort of shunned social layer, complexity and a lot of like hypothecation and derivatives and stuff like that. But yeah, inevitably there's a certain distortion there.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I like to tell people like when I'm trying to like design products and leverage Bitcoin in Bitcoin layers to make products, that like I tell them like I just don't even think about the law, because what I think about is how can I make this in a way that I don't have to think about the law.
Right.
And if I can't do that, then that means it's a bad design.
Yep.
And whereas on the Ethereum side, it's like they just skip that part and they just go with it, and it's proven to be pretty profitable because they end up kind of they don't ask for permission, they ask for forgiveness, and they end up getting rich in the process, and then they can pay those bills and those fines quite easily.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings me to the other hand, which is like the chilling effect. And so like I remember, well, I have a few examples, but like back in 2013 and 2014, Bitcoiners were doing the same thing. They were doing it like much more, I guess, obviously centralized. Like there were all these like Bitcoin securities exchanges. I don't know if you were around or ever researched this stuff.
No, that was before my time. But I've gotten some sense of like the colored coins and stuff like that.
Well, it was actually they were actually literally securities exchanges where people issued things like their own like virtual IPOs and things like this.
Yep.
And people you could buy shares of startups and startup mining operations. There was a lot of scammy stuff.
Wow.
There were some Ponzi schemes. This is where the original Ponzi scheme that went to the guy went to jail for, Trendon Shavers. He was using these platforms, but they were legitimate things too. There were people issuing bonds. There were people issuing like complex sort of like derivatives that had like dynamic features related to like Bitcoin mining difficulty. There were all kinds of things. But what happened was eventually, some people lost some money and they complained to the SEC, and the SEC started making phone calls to everybody saying, hey, do you know about this? What do you know about that? They wrote, there's a very famous letter. You should definitely look it up if you haven't seen it, where they tried to get in touch with this guy, Romanian guy, Mircea Popescu, and he was doing an exchange called MPEX. And they sent him these letters basically trying to get him to give them information about his users. And he like famously like told them basically to go fuck themselves. And this is I'll link it to you later, but there's these
I never heard of this. Wow. Yeah. Interesting.
Very entertaining letters back and forth between them. And like they were trying to say, how do we call you? And he said, well, what you can do is you can auth in my IRC channel. And it was very cool, very interesting. But, all of that SEC action led to all of those people that were fledgling interested in this kind of thing, using Bitcoin this kind of way. They would have eventually done things like Ethereum is doing, like putting securities on tokens and trying to do DeFi things. It was just way too early to even have those designs yet. But the SEC chilled it all by calling all these people, scaring them and telling them to stop.
Right.
And they even find some people like Eric Voorhees, for example, had some early things that he did that he ended up paying like these small fines for, stuff like that. And then like also on the chilling side with the ICOs, after having, me myself being a Bitcoiner, having seen all of that, from years before, seeing ICOs, during that time, I was running Exotica, which was the adult video platform, project that I was trying to do. And I saw all these people, I saw competitors even, and I think you know them, doing these ICO schemes. And I'm thinking, fuck, man, like I could raise millions of dollars, no problem right now from idiots. And I have to compete with this. And I had never raised anything. I was using my own money and my own, startup. And I had to decide, I was like, should I do an ICO? Should I try to start raising money, or should I just like get a job? And that was, I ended up working at BitRefill. Really was, I just decided I couldn't go down those paths. And
right.
But so it sucks because like I feel like the people that are good are the only people that end up getting affected by these laws. And
It's
the people
true.
that are
It's so
bad
true.
make
Yeah.
all the money.
That's true. Yeah. I wouldn't say it's so much good or bad, but
Yeah.
it really has been a case of fortune favors the bold, and I never would have expected that the enforcement, especially after Clayton came out swinging in 2017, right? He was saying, "I'm going to punish the lawyers." He was right. He was like hopping mad, in 2017. And what did we get? Like basically Kick and Telegram, right, and a few like really obvious scams,
Yeah.
right, and everything in between those two extremes was totally fine, and a lot of people got extremely rich. It's kind of an amazing thing.
So like, what do you think? What should Bitcoiners do? Should we just act more, act more illegally and just pay for it later? Or like, I know you're a lawyer; it's hard for you to say,
right?
But you know what I mean. Like, what are we to do to be good people, but also get good funding and get the same VCs that are interested in supporting Ethereum projects?
It's a really, really tough problem. Not only I think from a pure regulatory perspective, but also from a decentralization perspective, right? Because if you do one of these huge VC funded pre-mines, and let's say it's a governance token, or whatever it is, or even if it's just supposed to have monetary value, it's not really decentralized. Like I personally think the economic layer matters, and if there are a lot of whales who got in very cheap, that's a form of attack. The fact that they could dump. I subscribe to that theory, whereas I suspect many Ethereans don't care about that. So that's one issue, just even from sort of the point of view of objectives, right? Which is you're going to have extra economic centralization from taking on these types of investments. And then as to the legal side, it's just so hard for me to say anymore because, you have like Hester Peirce, who's an SEC commissioner, right? And she came out with a very liberal proposal, for how she thinks this should be handled, which is basically, don't treat the tokens as securities except for fraud, and give the project 3 years to either become functional, right, which is a very low standard. It's probably functional much earlier than that. Everything is functional, or to not be directly or indirectly controlled by anyone. I forget the exact wording. Now, if it was kind of a two-prong, that would be a little less shocking to me, maybe. But just that's all it has to be. It's just functional, and it's not a security. So on the one hand, you have that, but on the other hand, I have my actual understanding of the actual laws, which is very different from that type of super liberal approach. And on the contrary, I think nearly all tokens that were used directly or indirectly as part of some fundraising scheme are at least initially going to be securities, in my opinion, even though most people are not treating them that way even today. So, the actual laws. And then if you actually call the SEC to discuss an issue, you'll get a staff member, and they're not talking like Hester Peirce. They're like ultra conservative. And so it's very hard. And yet, on the other hand, they don't seem to do much about any of the many things that are happening. So it's extremely confusing, and and I can't it's just hard for me to tell people what they should do from like an overall business or risk mitigation perspective. And I think it's somewhat up to their individual risk preference. And it's so easy to be either wrong or right, because who knows, a Dem could get elected, right? Biden could get elected, and he could appoint someone who is much more aggressive on enforcement, right, and takes the securities laws very literally, and they could start going on the warpath against this again, just like Clayton did when he started his term, right? They want to start out strong and they want to make a name for themselves, and for whatever reason they decide to pick this, right? Because it's easy. It would be easy for them, to go on a warpath against this, and just hard to say, right?
Yeah. So yeah, you mentioned the SEC, and I think that it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago that they had this like pseudo definition. They like doing this this guidance, which you've probably seen me mention recently. I think guidance is a very insidious thing for regulators to do, because it's like basically chilling law.
Right.
But they mentioned that, like, in the concept of Hester Peirce, having this kind of grace period or such, this concept of sufficiently decentralized. Like, how do you have any idea how they could attempt to actually like quantify that and actually enforce anything to do with that concept?
Yeah, so I've given a lot of thought to this one. When the Hinman speech first came out, that was an amazing moment because everyone in the Ethereum world really thought they were all in big trouble. There'd been like hundreds of subpoenas supposedly sent out in February. I think the Hinman speech came out in like May or something of 2018, somewhere around there. And just a few short months before, there'd been all these subpoenas flooded to everyone. Basically, the market started to tank, and I do think it was partly because of that. And people were really scared, and so like people were worried they would go to jail and things like that, right? Then and people even thought ETH might be declared a security, and like all of Ethereum could potentially be an illegal securities exchange because it had hosted ICOs, right? And so on an ultra literal,
and it was based on an ICO as well.
That's right, exactly. Well, that was one thing, but even if you said that one, the ICO was fine, you still could get them in another way by the fact that they hosted all these other ones, that were even more clearly securities, right? And so people were worried about that, and then boom, this Hinman speech comes out, and people had varying reactions to it. But my reaction after a little reflection was extremely positive, and I've stuck with the Hinman approach throughout and been an advocate of the Hinman approach throughout, whereas many other people, including Hester Peirce, they don't really seem to like the Hinman approach. But what it basically says is, look, if you just take the securities laws and think about it, right? Yeah, early on, there is centralization of the value drivers for why the value of this token would increase, and therefore it satisfies the Howey test, and therefore, it's a security early on. But over time, if the project is successful, and that's the tricky part, because I really do think that depends partly on luck. You can't design for that, because it means, other people have to be passionate enough to step up and start independently on an unaffiliated basis, start investing either their sweat equity or their money or whatever into this ecosystem. And at that point, he kind of looked at the situation with Ethereum, and he said, yeah, I think he said to himself, look, there's this consensus thing, there's this EF thing, there's these other people also investing and paying developers. And if, let's just say I said if ETH was a security today, who would be the securities reporter, right? Who is the person we would make file reports? Like, it just didn't make sense at that point because there are too many unaffiliated value contributors.
Basically, what I was asking it was about the concept of sufficiently decentralized.
Basically, Hinman's speech was saying, look, most of these things start out off as securities, right? Because there's a relatively small group of affiliated people who are responsible for driving future value to the token. And when people buy the token, they are buying it with the reasonable expectation that those efforts will continue and that therefore the value of the token will go up. But however, since it's open source software, right, as more and more people step up independently and start contributing value, it becomes increasingly nonsensical to try to apply the securities laws to that, because which of those people would you pick to be the securities law reporter, right? The securities law thing is really a disclosure regime. There's supposed to be a filer, that's filing reports about the risks and the financials and all these things, right? And so at a certain point, it just stops making sense to say that one out of these many value contributors should be reporting to the SEC about it. And it's really just that simple. So I thought that was a very good approach that sort of was ultimately technology neutral, right? Because it's not saying, hey, if something is a token, it has a different rule. It's saying that, no, based on the principles of the securities laws, if the value drivers are so numerous and diverse, then it just, the securities laws aren't designed to deal with that situation. They don't apply anymore. So that's always the approach I thought was good, coherent, etc. But the industry has really fought that Hinman type of approach, even within the SEC. Like Hester Peirce's proposal is not really ultimately a very Hinman-esque approach, I would say, because her definition of network maturity, when it stops being a security, just counts mere functionality, right? If something can be functional but still centralized. So, what I thought would happen is, the SEC would create this sort of lighter weight like Reg A plus style regime for tokens. You issue the token, you do the reporting for a couple of years, then it can stop being a security, hopefully if you're lucky and enough people liked it and stepped up and started contributing value. And I thought it would all work that way, but we haven't made any progress like that whatsoever. There's been zero progress. And I think a big reason for that is that the SEC, to circle back to the question, the SEC never actually bothered to really define sufficient decentralization. I tried to define it in a couple of different articles. I think my definition is pretty good, but I'm sure it could be improved upon, right? I sort of gave like a conservative version and a more flexible version, and some variations on each of those, right? And I think if they I don't know why, but when the speech came out, every lawyer was immediately like, how you can't define decentralization. I actually think you can, right? Because you can look at all the elements of power over the system, right? There's like the power over the means of producing blocks. There's the power over the means of producing the software client. There's the economic power of how concentrated it is. You can go down the list and do all those things, and you can, develop some rules of thumb or some rough sense, like we do on every other legal test, where we leave it somewhat to the discretion of the judges, right? We leave it fuzzy and we let them figure it out. You could do that, and you could measure whether the system is fairly decentralized, relative to the securities laws. And I think that would be a great approach. I don't know why it was abandoned.
I think actually listening to you maybe helped me come up with what might be a very simple definition as far as regulators are concerned. It's sufficiently decentralized just means too expensive to regulate.
Yeah. That's actually very good. I like that a lot.
And I mean, that really is and it actually is harmonizing with what Bitcoin is trying to say. Like, Bitcoin also can't measure its own decentralization. We just know we're the most decentralized.
Right.
And all it really has to mean is that decentralized enough for what? To not be attacked. Well, who's attacking, in the context of our current conversation? Regulators.
Right.
Why won't they attack if they can't afford to? It's just like with the IRS, like the IRS saying we don't audit people that make a lot of money because it costs more to audit them. Like they're sufficiently protected from the IRS just because the IRS doesn't have enough budget to do that task.
Yeah, it's not a bad way of looking at it at all. I mean, I think it's a pretty good proxy. The only problem with it, right, is that, of course, for some regulator to say, oh, the reason why it's not regulated is because it's too expensive to regulate, is going to be a pretty bad look politically. But as an actual substantive definition, I think it's pretty good.
I don't know if you believe this, but I put it this way, and I think of it this way. Do you think that there could be exposure for the kind of ring of companies that currently churn out ICOs? Like, I'll name names. I won't say that I have any evidence. It's just kind of more of a worry than an accusation. But like, for example, like how you see A16Z and some of their, supporting investment companies, choose these coins, and then they end up getting listed on Coinbase, and you have this kind of like this vending machine cycle where things kind of just get funded and listed, and these things aren't really decentralized. They're just like little projects with teams, and they're, it's the same team and same company, or suite of companies lending the BTC to wrap it, or mining the altcoin that has nobody using it yet. And it's like just very centralized thing, but it ends up getting like these great liquidity opportunities by being exposed to, on the main page, or even paying people to learn about, a coin on Coinbase, where you can have this like Coinbase earn or learn or whatever they call it these days. Like, do you see any exposure there, or at least even ethical issues with that kind of ring?
Yeah, I think I see both legal and ethical issues, and there's definitely a lot of potential, or a lot of theoretical exposure, right? The Telegram case, for example, what that case really was about was underwriting. So the securities laws regulate underwriting activity, which basically means, in the classic case, right, it's when Goldman Sachs and a consortium of banks take, like Uber or something when it was private, and they negotiate a deal with Uber to buy a bunch of the stock of Uber and then sell it on to the public, right? That's called underwriting. And that is basically why the conversion of SAFs in Telegram was enjoined by the court, because they said, look, these investors never intended to hold this token long term. They were getting it to flip it, and that's called underwriting. So it's possible that someone could accuse. Those are all venture investors. Some of them were U.S. based, and some of them, I've heard are pretty plugged in U.S. based investors in the Telegram thing. But the SEC, for whatever reason, hasn't gone on the attack on that issue, even though they obviously could in many cases. And I don't know why that is. Something to do with their strategy, or I don't know. But theoretically, it's there, right? Now, for a lot of the things, I would call like the new wave of token issuances, which is really these governance tokens associated with DeFi companies. Of course, they're smart, right? So, the facts are distinguishable from Telegram in part because, usually there's a longer lockup, and usually, query which way this cuts, it kind of cuts in both directions at once. But, part of the problem in Telegram is the judge said, well, look, this token is so obviously inherently valueless that it's just unbelievable that anyone would plan to hold it for long term, right? And therefore, it must be an underwriting violation. Whereas a lot of these other tokens, think about something like MKR, for example, right? MKR could be a good investment forever, in theory, right? Because it's designed, it does have intrinsic mechanics by which it should go up in price just by virtue of people using the smart contract system. And so, they would argue that, right? They would argue, no, this has long-term value. We're not acting as underwriters, and it's all fine. And we haven't seen these issues litigated yet, and we haven't even really seen the SEC focus on these issues yet. But I think it's a great question, right? Because, if A16Z is invested in so many of these different companies, and then they're also invested in Coinbase, and that like gives certain companies like the opportunity to get a softer touch or something there. I don't know if that's true, but if it does, that's certainly not fair. And one of the goals of the securities laws is just to protect people from losing their money, like individuals, but it's also to create fair markets, right? And that's not a fair market, right? If that's the case. And so I do think people should be asking these questions and thinking about whether it doesn't have to be the SEC. There could be self-regulatory organizations that just try to make this more fair and more transparent.
I just feel like companies maybe like Coinbase get to be too aggressive sometimes when they see these liquidity opportunities from the consumer side. Like when they see that retail really wants something, like for example, like the recent DeFi hype, all of a sudden everybody was listing YFI and sushi, and everybody was fighting to list it first to get the liquidity. And it felt like the old Bitcoin days when people would do this thing they had this like thing called the Bitcoin gem. And it was basically just a website that was a Ponzi. It was like you put Bitcoin in, and at some point, if you wanted to, you could take the Bitcoin that was in it so far out, or you could wait till somebody else put more Bitcoin in. And it was like this like kind of hot potato, and everybody would just keep putting Bitcoin in to see how big they could get the hot potato.
Yeah.
And then eventually somebody would rug pull.
Right.
And that kind of is what DeFi feels like. And so like you mentioned, like, you don't know if there will be enforcement coming down already, but like, do you think that DeFi has a round of enforcement coming at them in the future?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
There will be things. One of the big things is like, a lot of the number one big target is definitely going to be swaps, right? If you create something that is meant to have the same value as a share of Apple stock, but is not a share of Apple stock, that's called a swap. That's a security swap. You could also do the same thing with commodities. You could create something that's not gold, but that's meant to have the same value of gold, right? And track it in the market, and that's going to be a commodity swap. That is like public enemy number one from our financial crisis in 2008, right? And it's kind of ironic, right? Because Bitcoin, this whole thing got started in the wake of that financial crisis, and now we're going into the exact same terrain. So you can be damn sure that sooner or later someone is going to get pegged for that one. And then I also think there's a lot of risk that many of these governance tokens could be securities. And I also think that some of the smart contract systems could be like leveraged retail commodities trading. That one I'm more, I think that one might end up more in the like reinvent a rationale for giving it type of thing, but you could argue it. So there's going to be actions for sure. A lot of people are worried about the money transmitter one. I'm not as worried about, and that has criminal penalties. I'm not as worried about that because there's no custody in these smart contracts. Like, unless they just want to ban this entire type of software being used, I just don't see how it could ever comply with that regime. So there'll be actions. I mean, one of the interesting questions to me, just looping back a little bit to your prior question, because I think this is really interesting and something I may have unique insights on, right, is that there's this subtler layer, right, to all these things, right, which is, what do people think it is, and what do people think this stuff is, and what is it really? Because most of these venture-backed companies have like side deals with the VCs that even in the VC's capacity as token holders, it makes the development team treat those token holders differently from the normal token holders. Like, for example, I'm speculating here based on market practices. I don't know this, right? But if, what I suspect is the case is that both the Uniswap company and the key people within it have signed contracts with the venture capital investors there that say, hey, if we ever create a fork of Uniswap that has another token, we're going to cut you in the same percentage of that token as the original token. And the other token holders, they don't have that deal, right? So, whether or not it makes it a security or whatever, there's some type of issue there, right? Some type of basic thing where, like, not all these token holders are being treated the same. And there could be some type of situation like a DAO-like situation where the founders are thinking about forking and deciding whether to do it and how it affects the different people, and which fork the founder goes with could be very important. And it may be the case that a lot of the ordinary token holders don't know that the founder has this hidden constraint in the form of legal agreements they've signed with other investors. And I think that's very fruitful fodder for some type of regulatory inquiry as well. I'm skeptical that it'll happen just because so little is happening anyway, but I think people should be thinking about that sort of thing.
One thing I'm thinking about is, I don't know if I'm right about this theory, but it seems in line with what I was saying about, the difference between being decentralized being, if it's too expensive to enforce. Like, I feel like the DeFi rug pulls and these kinds of things have been higher entropy and more pain in a shorter time frame. And one thing I've noticed is it seems like when people actually take the time to report, maybe in quantity or even in quantity of dollars, loss on these kinds of things, when they actually report something to the SEC that they lost money and they want to do something about it, it almost seems like that's what helps define whether the SEC actually or other agencies do something about it. Like,
sure,
do they end up? Is it basically that they end up having to do something about it once it's reported?
Yeah, they don't have to do anything because that's why there's a private right of action under the securities laws, so that people can sue for themselves. Like, for example, XRP holders are suing Ripple right now, right? Maybe, what would SEC have done if that private litigation hadn't arisen? I don't know. But if there's a private litigation, they usually let that play out. So now it also goes the other way though, right? Because if the token is done well, even if it violated securities laws, what's going to happen if the SEC then goes after that project? Well, the token is going to tank, right? Or it's not going to do great. So it's almost as if basically good price performance plus keeping a low profile while you ramp up the price is like kind of like a form of enforcement protection to an extent, right? And as a practical matter, I can't really deny that seems to be part of what's going on here.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird catch-22, I guess, for an agency to be like, well, if we try to regulate this, a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I have one more question about this side of legal stuff, and then I want to see if we can move to talking more a little bit about business stuff. Do you, like, yourself as a lawyer, maybe this is a hard question, but I'm sure you've thought about it. Do you believe in regulation? Like, do you think that it's good? Do you think that more regulation, I always like to say, I think that, people that are asking for clarified rules and more regulation, like I always feel like they're asking for the wrong thing, and that
Right.
they should actually be asking for like less, and to remove laws and like to get rights instead. And do you believe in this? Do you think that, the proper approach is to modernize regulatory agencies and elaborate them? Or do you think that there's actually a better path to maybe simplifying them and getting their hands out of things?
It depends on the context. I think I like some of them and don't like others of them. The money transmitter stuff, which is basically insane Orwellian financial surveillance that was passed into law on the pretext of, like a lot of like wartime type stuff after 9/11 that turned out to be fake later. I'm not a fan of that at all. Right, I just think that should go away. I don't think it's accomplishing anything that's good. I think it's accomplishing a lot of things that are bad, and I think it's just completely unworkable existentially. Right, the the securities law stuff, I actually think we should have securities law regulations. I have some ideas. I'd like them to be cheaper to comply with. I'd like them to be simpler. Right? If I had my way, I would just slap a big old. There's a rule called 12b one. 12b1, am I blanking? But there's a rule under the Exchange Act that basically says, you become a public company, when you have like more than 1,199 investors, 1,990 investors, and more than $10 million in assets, right? And that's sort of like a size of market, size of issuer type test. Like, I don't know why you can't just apply that same type of threshold to virtually all the rules other than the anti-fraud stuff, and it would make a lot more sense, right? Because if it's a small issuer, like the idea of filing these incredibly expensive audited reports with the SEC, it just doesn't make sense, right? And when the SEC has tried to make ICO issuers do that, they just always end up flaking and fleeing the country after agreeing to the settlement because it's like basically impossible. Like, it's just unworkable. Mm-hmm. So they should either do that, or they should just make them cheaper to comply with, which I also think is possible. But they should reform it in some way. But I do think they're necessary, right? Because you cannot have the foxes guarding the henhouse, right? If the types of information asymmetries and trust holes that the securities laws are designed to cope with are present, it's completely unrealistic to say that the relevant people can self-regulate that, or as long as they're just honest actors and they don't commit fraud, that then it's fine and you should let them do whatever they want. Because the whole point is, they will always disclose the stuff that they are comfortable disclosing, and the thing that they just feel kind of people might not like to know about, that's going to be the thing that they don't disclose, and that's going to be the thing that if anything blows up, that'll be the basis on which it blows up, right? Like, look at a situation like the Dow, right? Again, not trying to say ETH is a security, but like, you can see that similar issues can exist even if it wasn't a security. That there's these conflicts of interest, right? Like, Vitalik was like a curator of the Dow and had an investment in the Dow, and also like had a lot of influence over what goes into Geth, which is the Ethereum core client, basically, and so on. And how can you not think that number one, if they were to just decide to disclose that by themselves, they disclose it in a way that's not super helpful and clear, and that how can you think it wouldn't be helpful if there was some neutral agency making sure that relevant facts like that are disclosed to people when their money is at stake? So I just think it's naive, to think that there shouldn't be the securities laws, but they could definitely be improved and made cheaper and more reasonable and clearer, and all those things. And commodities laws, I would sort of say, are similar. Those are like the three main ones, right?
So like, I agree on this, on like the context with like conflict of interest. Like for example, priming is the one that a lot of people don't really realize or think about. And I don't know if this is what you call it in your game and in your side of the world, but I define priming as basically the inability for anyone to ever know who actually, contributed to something on the blockchain. So you can make anything look as successful as you want it to look. Like, for example, like, right now we get a lot of Ethereum guys bragging about how much Bitcoin is wrapped into Ethereum. And I think to myself, okay, well, like if I wanted to make it that, quote unquote true, air quotes true, then all I'd have to do is find somebody like, say, 16Z to give me enough Bitcoin to wrap to make it look like it was extremely successful.
Yeah.
And that would be a way to catch all the fish to use my product.
Yeah.
And this is how ICOs, I think a lot of them got a lot of the money. People would say, oh, I raised a $40 million ICO, but what if 30 million of it was just from your friends making it look like it was successful just so you could get 10 million from the fish. And so like this is definitely a conflict of interest that you cannot solve in on the blockchain at least. But on the flip side, like how are we supposed to regulate ourselves or design mechanisms to regulate ourselves if we're not given that path? And so like, if we remove the regulation, I think it would cultivate and instigate more work on, say, things like webs of trust, digital reputation systems, ways to hold people accountable and responsible for when they do bad things. Like, I don't think being anti-regulation is about, saying that we think everybody will just behave themselves. It's about saying that we can establish systems of punishment that are just as effective, if not more effective, if you let us.
Sure. Yeah. And I do, like, I'm very interested in all those things, and I think they could become a viable alternative to a lot of aspects of, not only regulation, but also the legal system even more broadly, right? It's a question of, you mentioned punishment. I certainly think those systems could punish people. A lot of the thinking behind regulation, especially securities law regulation, is to proactively prevent harm before it happens, right? That's not always possible, right? But in theory, right, if you have someone who's doing securities law reporting, like Tesla is a great example, right? Like, Elon Musk is tweeting out, I have a take private offer at 420. Well, if Tesla wasn't a reporting company subject to SEC jurisdiction, it would have been a lot slower and harder for them to go after him for doing that and for making sure it was accurate and all those things, right? Whereas once it's subject to SEC jurisdiction, they're able to move very, very quickly on that. They're able to, they have all the authority they need to go into court and say, look, we looked into this over the last few days, and it looks like it's completely made up. Please enjoin it, And so, it enables them to sort of stop it at an earlier stage. I do think, though, that it's a judgment call as to when something is systemically important enough that you need that kind of preventative measure and not just the punishment measure, right? But it's harder for me to see how the tech is going to do the preventative stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is more of a kind of libertarian kind of concern to worry about, just how do we actually make this, non-aggressive, and what does punishment actually mean in this environment? But like, for example, like the Lightning Network is kind of a primitive example of self-regulation. Like the way that it's designed, you are exposing yourself to the other person in your channel having the capability to cheat you, just through the design of the network and how things have to eventually settle on chain. And so there's a punishment mechanism that is deterministic within the system. And so if somebody does try to cheat you, they lose everything.
Right.
And so like there are designs once we are put in the situation that we have to create them.
Yeah, and that's why I got into the space, because I think there's huge potential for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I do think the more stuff that we come up with along those lines, the less of a need for regulation there'll be. Right. For sure. So I'm a huge fan of that. And I'll give you an Ethereum example, right? Moloch DAO, right? Which is a particular smart contract pattern that is used for various DAOs, was built on this principle of the rage quit. Right. So, I've never heard of like a venture capital fund, where you can, invest your money and then you can have the confidence where you can take it out at any time for any reason instantly and no one can stop you. right?
Mhm.
But that's basically what a Moloch DAO is, because the money's sitting in a smart contract and no one can stop you from taking it out, unless there's some hidden security flaw in the code we don't yet know about. And I think that's a similar thing, because that's not governance, but what that does is it's an example of reducing the need for governance. So a lot of the rules about being a fiduciary and these sorts of things, the more mechanisms like that which you have, the less of a need there is even for those corporate governance type of rules. So law will be eaten away by the software over time, for sure.
So I want to try to bring this back around now to, business use cases, business concerns. And I know you have a lot of experience and you've worked with a lot of different startups and mergers and,
Sure.
different things even before you got into crypto. Bitcoin crypto. I know my audience doesn't like to use the word crypto. It personally doesn't really bother me. The fact is other altcoins do exist, and
Right.
so whether you like them or not, you have to have some way to talk about all of it. And so
Yep.
I'm gonna warn my audience now. I'm gonna use the word crypto, and it doesn't bother me to use that word. I am like one of the most hardcore Bitcoin maximalists you'll find, so leave me the fuck alone about it. But talking about businesses and startups and such, like I have more broad questions, so I'm hoping maybe you can lead a little bit. Do you have any comments or advice regarding, say, the fundraising, term sheets, founding related to crypto and businesses in this kind of arena in the current, the current fundraising environment? Just anything you can think of that you think you maybe have unique experience about that you could help other people with in the situation of having a startup and raising funds.
There are a bunch of things. One thing I think that is very different between startup founders, who I've worked with a lot, and C-suite level executives who I've also worked with a lot, back when I was in Big Law, is that C-suite level executives understand what a negotiation is and understand that they can negotiate, and that someone is not going to hate them if they try to do that. Right, or think they're a bad person, and they understand what leverage is, and they know how to do a deal, and they understand that the situation they're in is a deal-making situation, and that's what they're supposed to do. Right. Many times, young founders in their 20s, often in their 20s, but it could even be older. Right. It's not an age thing; it's just an experience thing. They don't understand that it's a negotiation, right? And they're very, very reluctant to make someone mad or ask for too much, or these sorts of things. And I think what that has meant is, ironically, in this space, especially DeFi startups have been so hot to invest in, right, the last 6 months, where people are really competing to get in the rounds and stuff as investors. And, I look at that as a deal lawyer and I say, man, these startups have a lot of leverage. I hope they're using it. And a lot of times they really don't use it very much. One of these big guys comes in, they said, hey, this is the way we do things. It's got to, the token is this way and we're going to pre-mine it, and, so on and so forth. And I think a lot of times, as we discussed earlier, the patterns that they want can have a lot of regulatory risk, and they also might not be optimal from a decentralization perspective either. And, the founders roll over more often than they need to, right? So yeah, that's the number one thing. Understand you're negotiating. Understand you might have a heck of a lot of leverage in many situations, and that no doesn't always mean no, right? As long as you're nice, don't be a jerk. But the other thing I would point out is just that these venture rounds, these deals, affect the tech. It'd be naive to think so, and it's not getting disclosed, right? If the company that developed the software and the key people within that company, the CEO, the founder, whatever you want to call it, the key technical guys, sign agreements with the investors that say, look, you got 12% of these tokens. We agree that if we ever fork the protocol again or deploy a new instance of it, and there are tokens associated with that, you'll get 12% of those as well, right? Even if you sold a bunch, even if you currently hold 10%, you're going to get another 12%. So the conception that the investors in the space have developed is that even though the code is open source, and therefore cannot be owned, that nevertheless they are investing in the code. Really, they call it the protocol to make it sound like it's something different, but it's just the code. And that basically anytime that code is deployed by someone who in some way benefited from their investment, they're going to get a non-dilutable, like a non-diluted stake in that instance of that smart contract. And this is not being disclosed, and it could affect a lot of things, right? If Vitalik had that deal with someone when the DAO fork came up, then it is possible that could have affected his thinking, right? Like, let's just say, for example, that there was some big early investor in the ICO who had this deal with Vitalik, and that person had already sold a lot of their ETH. Right. And then the DAO hack happens and they're thinking about forking. Now, instead of just deciding freely what he wants to support, Vitalik has to sit there and think, well, if I fork it adversely, that means I got to give a full 14% again. To this investor who already sold their other ETH. And so now it's a much more significant reconfiguration of the economics and so forth. People need to know this stuff. Right, people need to know that not all the token holders are equal, and I think as far as conducting your venture round, that's never going to change unless some founders start pushing back on it and say, no, this is open source software. Open source software means open source. I'll give you the tokens that we're producing, but I can't promise to you that every fork is going to give you the same 14%. A million different things could happen. And by the way, I don't control this thing anymore once we're done, right? And really, I think we should shut down the company or something after a little while, because what are we really doing? This is not our system. It's a public commons. So there needs to be more pushback like that. Otherwise, all of these projects will be turned into Ripple. And that is, in my opinion, that is what the venture capital investors, would ultimately like very much, is that not only can they get the value from the token popping, but then, 5 years later, they can also, take the company public and do an IPO with its stock as well. I mean, how great would that be for the investors? They basically get a double dip, right? And they get the best of all worlds and all the benefits of having a business with none of the regulations. And this is just not what it's supposed to be, in my personal opinion. And I think in the opinion of a lot of the founders, but it will end up being that unless they take a stronger voice and negotiate.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of Bitcoiners would say, as far as the DAO goes, that really is what happened. That the reason why Ethereum Classic exists and everything forked was because it was, whether it was Vitalik or not, I don't know, I don't care. But certainly the most major investors of Ethereum, lost a lot of Ethereum ETH in that hack. And,
Sure.
There was probably literally phone calls to Vitalik and other people and saying, help, we
Sure.
lost all our money. And it was probably only like 10 guys,
Yeah. Now, I think let's just assume that that's all that was. It was only just what you said. I think that's just part of what happens with this type of system. Yes, there are people who have money, they care, they can contact each other and so on. Where to me it becomes problematic, right, is there's an actual legal contract that is actually limiting various parties' discretion, and not everyone knows about that. Then, what you initially said is kind of bad in and of itself, right? It's insidery and all that. When you add a binding legal agreement to it, it becomes all the worse, right?
Yeah, unless everybody involved is some kind of benevolent saint, making commercial interests that are secret that affect, a protocol can get bad really easily. I see what you're saying. And then going back to what you were mentioning about, advising founders to, treat this more, like a negotiation process. Yeah, I definitely agree. I felt that myself in the past, where it's I think what it is as a founder, you feel like what you're doing is, asking for permission to get rich someday while asking for a job at the same time.
Right.
And so you're being really careful to how you negotiate, because you feel like they might just say no, and that's it. You don't get the job. and
Right.
And these people are supposed to be, more experienced and professional than you. So yeah, that's probably really good advice. I think it's definitely important that founders, take the time to probably get a lawyer and make sure they have somebody experienced with this stuff advising them, so they get a not only the best deal, but a healthy deal.
Exactly.
Kind of related to this, more of an observation. Maybe I'll figure out a way to turn it into a question. But another thing I've noticed since I know you also deal with mergers and acquisitions and such. I've talked to over the years, I've talked to a lot of projects, and I've tried to find ways to consolidate the industry, whether it be, trying to organize an acqui-hire or a merger. And what I find, and tell me if you find the same thing, I guess, I find that in the crypto environment and the Bitcoin environment, even alone outside of altcoins, the valuations for open source based software projects are just all way, way too high. And this ends up kind of trapping the founders in their projects and making it basically impossible most of the time to do a reasonable acqui-hire or a reasonable merger. Do you notice things like that? Do you think that there's like a way around that kind of situation where you have like two separate teams that really don't need to be building different things if they just could get along on as far as like merging their visions, but like because like team A was evaluated at $5 million, but they're only like 3 or 4 guys with an open source application, how do you resolve that situation?
And are you talking about token valuations or equity valuations?
Equity of the company. Keep in mind, I'm coming from the Bitcoin side, so I don't have any experience or examples to do with like ICOs or DeFi tokens.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I haven't encountered people having that problem from a valuation. I mean, usually what would happen, right? The natural thing is that the company with the higher valuation would be the nominal acquirer, right? And it would issue like a bunch of its stock, right, to the team with the smaller valuation, right? And then you kind of have a bigger organization that, theoretically, has the combined valuations of both, right? So, there should be ways to navigate that type of thing, particularly when it's equity. Now, when it's crypto, like if they have tokens outstanding, I think it becomes a much more difficult problem that is very interesting. And one of the projects I'm working on is to talk about crypto merger statutes, right? Because mergers it's a statutory thing, right? The reason you can do a merger is because in the state of Delaware, there's a law that says you can magically convert one company's stock into the stock of another company, right? It's an inherently legal concept, and it's inherently coercive, right? Because you only need majority approval to do that, and even if some people didn't want to convert their stock into the other stock, they're like forced to, right? That's why it's useful. Mm-hmm. So we don't have anything like that for crypto, but in theory, something like that for crypto could be enormously valuable. Look at the Steemit thing, the debacle that happened there with Justin Sun, buying a bunch and then them forking and all that stuff. Now, maybe that's the desired outcome. That might be the desired outcome. But in theory, you could imagine that maybe a friendlier deal where both of the majorities wanted it to work and it felt like it was good. And there was just kind of like a vocal or opportunistic dissident minority who didn't like it and made it very hard to do that deal. In theory, it might be nice to have a way to coerce them into the socially optimal way and like combine the two tokens. But, on the other hand, I could also make a lot of arguments against that. So these are areas where I think it's like very interesting to compare the corporate norms to the blockchain norms and think about, whether it makes sense to adapt any of those tools.
Yeah, I think in the case of Justin, that probably was the desired outcome. I mean, I think what really happened there was he kind of scammed himself. He let his ego get bigger than his understanding of game theory.
Yes.
And he just didn't really think about the fact that nobody was just going to let him, like anybody would have let him buy all of the tokens like that. They couldn't have stopped him from doing that.
Right.
But to try to just say he owns it, like obviously the people are, trying to actually, as centralized as Steemit may be and as little used as it may be, the users could easily just walk away. They had nothing to gain.
Right.
Matter of fact, they actually, in a lot of times, will have more to gain because of the information, lack of information propagation among all of the people involved. That you have 2 chains to sell your tokens on.
Exactly.
Some people will buy on the one that you think sucks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So maybe that's how we want it to be, right? Maybe we don't want a merger statute, but it's interesting to think about.
Same with Bitcoin. That's how we wanted it to be. We had Bcash and these things like this, and it worked out. Although I would say it would have been nice if there was some kind of mechanism to have something like Bcash die faster. Maybe that's just vindictive of me, but like, right, it's still a sad scam now, because it's like there are bag holders and they're going to be promoting it until they give up, and they have little reason to stop.
That's right.
They can just wait, and it's kind of a sad thing. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Another broad kind of question. I'm sure you've been in the room or received requests or emails for some really kind of either ugly, dumb, or evil sort of
Sure.
things. Like, do you have any examples of just interesting, like crazy things that you've either witnessed or been a part of? Without going over legal grounds here, I'm just trying to, I know you've seen some shit, so I'm trying to see, if there's anything you can share.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think here what I could say. Well, I've certainly heard, especially in earlier days, when I was a little bit less good at filtering people out, like people would just have some like really wacky ideas. You know what I mean? Like one I heard was like, well, what's a big problem? It's that people sell their crypto too early, right? And they sell it too early, and therefore the price isn't going up as much as it could while they still hold it. And so we're going to form a project that solves this problem. We'll just have people deposit their ETH into a smart contract, and it'll just lock up their ETH for a period of time, right? And they'll pay us for this. and it's just like,
I've
really?
gotten this pitch from people in Bitcoin too.
And I'm just like, what? Like, come on, man. Like, you could just form a trust or something. Like, it'd be better, because you wouldn't have the security risk of the smart contract and stuff, right? And even it's just dumb, right? People generally like more discretion, not less. And, unless they're just some kind of like they have some strange like compulsion to sell, like to spite themselves, right? Like, I just don't see what problem is solving. So there've been many things like that where they're just like kind of like lame ideas, right? And the more I learn about the tech, the easier it is for me to spot those type of things, because I do read the code and I try to get as technical as possible. And then, yeah, I've definitely come across things that I can't really describe for obvious reasons, where I've just been like, this either, in some cases that I thought it was, ultimately a scam. Sometimes the person I was directly dealing with was like, maybe as much of a victim of that scam as anyone else might be, and sometimes not. And then, other times, it's just sort of like a something that is ambitious and could produce value, but just has so many regulatory issues that it's just like, come on, do you really want to do this? You could throw an entire big law team at this for a year, and you still wouldn't have like a very confident approach, So like those are kind of like the three buckets, I would say, like too ambitious and legally complex, dumb, and then like semi-fraudulent. Yeah, I've gotten like a good mix of all of those.
Do you think that there are any products that Bitcoiners should be focusing on, for the future, or thinking about, giving a little more funding and attention to in their startups, that maybe they could learn from the ETH side? And then, from the ETH side, do you think that there are any kind of, Bitcoin products and things that they should be focusing on more to compete better?
Well, I think DAOs have turned out to be a pretty amazing way of getting the fundraising control more in the hands of the developers and the users. And although the original one, was a massive securities law violation and wasn't done correctly, the more modest ones that have come about since, mainly around the Moloch movement. So there's one I'm involved with called Metacartel Ventures DAO, and there's one that's sort of, I guess, loosely affiliated with Consensus called the Lao. They are actually structured in a legally compliant way, and they are hopefully a little bit friendlier of a source of funding for projects than like the big VCs would be, or at least that's the goal. And you don't really see that in the Bitcoin ecosystem, as far as I can tell. It's very reliant, as is a lot of development within the Ethereum ecosystem still, on this idea of, well, they're whales, right? And the whales are going to be incentivized to fund. And I don't know that theory of continued funding has turned out to be very true, right? Because like look at the big exchanges. I think probably in the early days people thought, oh, the exchanges will like fund a lot of Bitcoin core developers and stuff, but they don't fund anything like that. Instead, they formed a venture capital arm and they invest in projects on the same basis as any other venture capital investors, and they just look for the most profitable ones, right? So that there needs to be work on the funding end, and I do think that whether it's the Gitcoin thing, which I'm not as huge a fan of, or whether it's the DAO thing, which I'm more of a fan of, there's been a lot more thinking on that within the Ethereum ecosystem that could probably be enormously beneficial to the folks working on Bitcoin tech as well.
Mm-hmm. What about from the ETH side? Do you think that there's any kind of products or tech that they're neglecting that they should be paying more attention to from Bitcoin?
I think it's happening. So I'm bad here because I'm not as good on all the technical innovations within Bitcoin, and I want to fix that. But I would say that the L2 type of focus for scaling for Bitcoin is something that it seems like the Ethereum community, after these like enormous gas costs during this latest DeFi run up, are finally capitulating on that and not just putting all their hope on these like, genius supposed L2 innovations like sharding and stuff that will supposedly fix things. And so this type of, like, let's have a very scalable L1 and then a lot of L2s philosophy of Bitcoin, I do think is something that Ethereans should focus more on and are now focusing more on, because I just think it's more realistic and just a better model.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody coming from the Bitcoin side, that would probably be my first answer as well. That they started to be interested in L2s. They had Raiden and some other things, and they were kind of very early on acting like they were going to do their own Lightning and that kind of thing. But then everything turned to DeFi. I remember the DeFi push started all the way back in. It was like 2017 or 2018 where at the conferences they were already trying to pump it, and it didn't really take at first. And it really was in the last like year or two, pretty much after people started using DAI, then it started to kind of get some momentum and kind of move in that direction. And now, like you said, with high fees, they're looking at it again. I think maybe the problem on the ETH side that's going to be, I'm not sure if it's even conquerable, with things like ETH2. It makes it seem like, okay, well, ETH2 is like our promise. ETH2 is our solution. And it's almost like a layer 2 in that you have to like kind of move your coin to it. The only thing that makes it not a layer 2 is you can't move it back.
You're right.
Yeah.
It's a new blockchain. It's a brand new blockchain. I mean, well, I don't want to be too strong on this, but I guess I would say the thought has crossed my mind. Why didn't they just raise new capital for this? And they probably would have been able to produce it a lot faster and more efficiently on like a temporarily initially centralized basis, right? And they could have had like a new token for it as well. Now the counter to that is, well, it's proof of stake, so it's very important that the token be of high value in order for it to be secure. And so we need to somehow make the world think that this new ETH is the same as the old ETH. Through basically a magic trick. I mean, that's really what it is. It's almost like a psyop to say that these two things are the same, but I think it'll be a successful psyop, and I do think that'll make it more secure, so I guess I can't fault them too much. But in theory, it seems like it could have been done a lot more efficiently, and that it's just a new system.
Yeah, I haven't had to say it in a while, but what I like to say about this kind of situation is I always just say hard forks don't exist. I just do not believe in hard forks. And the reason is that they require economic migration, social migration. Mm-hmm. You can't just like print a new thing and force everybody to use it. And I think that actually you might end up being at least partly wrong with ETH2. I think it's not going to be as easy as they think it's going to be to get people. It could turn into a Bcash situation. They pulled it off with the DAO fork, and I think they were very lucky to pull that off because the original Ethereum really was an Ethereum classic. It just didn't socially work, to keep the old chain. But like with ETH2, you have a lot of people that are trying to build now on ETH, and they're getting kind of fucked, and you're gonna end up with two ETHs.
It's possible. It depends. I could see that as being a possible scenario. I think it's more likely if something sort of starts going wrong. Like they have some like have to do some rollbacks on ETH2 and this sort of thing, or it takes too long to get the smart contracts because 2.0 is not going to have smart contracts, right? It's like a very basic thing, right? That's only performing extra validation. And in the meantime, in parallel with that, people are actually making interesting strides on L1. Like there's a new client called TurboGeth that is much more state efficient, and so on, right? And so the predicates for what you just said are there. I guess I would say for that to actually turn into a hard fork, I think there'd have to be some bad luck involved somewhere as well. But it's definitely possible.
Yeah, I think maybe the cool answer might be somewhere in between what we're talking about, which would be like we still need a solution. We might need. I mean, we could just say, well, one day everything will ossify and we can do everything we ever could possibly need to do with soft forks. We do seem to get more and more innovative about how to make things happen with soft forks, but we do need like some kind of cryptographic deterministic way to force a migration. And I think that maybe is something that, Ethereum's trying to solve. I wish it weren't to go from, a normal blockchain to a proof of stake one, because that's just too different. But it would be interesting if somebody could design a way to, know that consensus had fully migrated and it was okay to kill the old chain.
Yeah, totally. And that's sort of what I'm talking about with like
other than it going to zero.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Well.
Right. Yeah, no, yeah, it's a fascinating question. And like the legal questions around it are fascinating as well. Cause like, well, what's consent? What's coercion in this context, right? Like, when Ethereum did a much more modest hard fork, I think it was earlier this year, maybe it was late last year, they broke a bunch of Aragon's smart contracts. And, how is this like, how do you make this decision, right? Ultimately, it's the guys who are writing the code for the core client who are deciding that it's okay to, put out a version that breaks Aragon software. And then the miners don't seem to care at all. They just take whatever they push out, right? But you're kind of like affecting people's property rights and other stuff, and they never consented to be subject to this form of governance, right? So there's a lot of questions there, and both as a lawyer and as someone who's interested in the tech, these things fascinate me.
Yeah, to me that sounds like that Ethereum probably isn't that decentralized still, because a blockchain to work properly does have to like kind of obey the intolerant minority. Like it has to like have a failure mode.
Yeah, I've been a big critic of the centralization on sort of the client, what I guess I would call the client layer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you combine that with I guess passivity, right? Like if the default is accepting there's this other, well, here's an interesting angle on this, right? In the securities law context, right? Like if a company is going to put forth a proposal to its shareholders, right? And that could be that proposal could be like, hey, we're going to do the merger with this other company, and by the way, as part of this merger, we're also changing a bunch of our governance rules around like approval thresholds and things like that. Well, people might like the economics of the merger, right? But they might not like the governance changes that go along, and it's being presented as a package deal. So in that situation, if it's a public company, the SEC will come in and they'll say, no. You're breaking these out into separate proposals, right? Yeah. And the shareholders are going to vote on them separately. Something like that is needed if you are going to have a system that hard forks often, like Ethereum does. Bitcoin is anti-hard fork for this reason, I think. But in theory, there's not like immoral to hard fork. But I think if you want to have that type of system, you need to find a way to make it non-coercive, or at least to have people to consent to some system of coercion. And it just doesn't work. Right? Even if they were to say, well, it's optional to adopt this new version that we just put out. Well, guess what? When they add the next new innovation that everyone does want, right? They're adding that to that same client that already has that prior innovation. So the system in Bitcoin, where even for soft forks, they have like this signaling system and, these flags and stuff. I think that's better and like has more legitimacy, even though it's slower and it has flaws, than what is done in Ethereum, where they just like drop this update and everyone just passively adopts it, and then some small minority sometimes gets screwed.
I'll be honest. I think that Bitcoin projects a better design, behavior than it really actually has as far as
Mhm.
soft forks go. If you get to like looking at how these things actually work and
Interesting.
what actually happens with something like UASF, like UAS, this is more of a fringe kind of belief or theory. And while I subscribe to it, and I know others do as well, I don't know if every core developer would agree. But I don't think there are necessarily definitive arguments against what I'm about to say.
Mhm.
But like something like UASF is actually pretty dangerous because what it does is it creates a situation where a few amount of nodes can create economic uncertainty for miners. So it kind of like you don't need like for imagine for like if you're a miner where even a 10% loss of your block reward would kill you, if it was just too much for you and it would put you under. And so imagine now you have 10% unreliability of nodes accepting your blocks. And so now you have this new expense. And so that's all.
Right.
So all it really takes is to keep upping that amount of unreliability on the nodes to where your blocks get rejected to force you to just say, fuck it, I'll support the fork. I'll support the soft fork.
Right.
And that's how UASF worked was, it was a lot of nodes signaling. And it's really difficult to tell the difference between an economic node that actually has transactions to, verify and one that doesn't. And so there's a little bit of Sybil possibility with this system.
For sure.
Particularly if the miners are very sensitive to any amount of, disruption in their block propagation, their block acceptance. So it could be dangerous if it were malicious, and it would be very dangerous if it were deceptively malicious, as in like something received a lot of social acceptance, but it was actually bad. And so thus, like say all of crypto or Bitcoin Twitter was fooled. And while Bitcoin Twitter may be small in proportion to all of the people that own Bitcoin, it's actually large in proportion probably to the amount of people that run nodes. And so it could actually, a deception of Bitcoin Twitter could cause a disruption of profit for miners. And thus you could have real issues with things like this.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think what we're getting at is there are these areas in blockchain where someone is going to be at least somewhat coercing someone or someone else, right? And who's doing the coercion to the other, and so on may vary from case to case, but these are real issues, and you can't pretend that the systems are like 100% voluntary and that exit is 100% free. It's just not true.
You had mentioned in one of your earlier answers that it seemed like exchanges weren't doing enough to support Bitcoin as far as investing in funding startups and things like this. I think that you're right that some of them, especially some of the bigger ones, seem to be more interested in seeing how many coins they can list, even in their VC efforts are funding mostly altcoins and things like this. But I do think it's changing. Like I think we saw recently Coinbase committing to funding 2Core devs. Even BitMEX has their 100x effort for funding some open source projects.
That's good.
Kraken has funded some things. Square Crypto is a big one. They've funded, I don't know, something like 20 different devs now.
Yes. Yeah, Square is huge, right? Yeah, and really good core devs that they've funded for sure.
Yeah, so I think it's shifting. I don't know. Do you see any other trends or areas that founders in Bitcoin could solicit better that maybe would be more open-minded to Bitcoin? Like I've seen lately some VCs starting to be interested in Lightning startups where they hadn't been maybe a year or two ago. And do you see anything like that too?
I haven't. No, I haven't really seen anything. I mean, as far as VCs go, they run in crowds.
Yeah,
they're very herd minded, and it's hard to find one who's willing to. If DeFi is hot, it's going to be hard to find one who's like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to not get into all these DeFi rounds. I'm going to go invest in a Lightning startup right now. And that I think is unfortunate. But I guess it's just sort of the way of the world.
All right, so I think we're almost done. I'll just ask you one more kind of typical last question.
Sure.
What do you think the next trends will be like in the coming years for Bitcoin and crypto? And what do you think the kind of legal environment will look like in, say, 10 years?
Yeah, it's interesting. Honestly, very, very hard to predict in generalities. I guess I'll say what I hope will happen, right? Which is that I hope that there are a lot of projects that really stay very close to the cypherpunk ethos, for lack of a better word, and that therefore they don't really need a lot of lawyers and they don't really need to worry about the law a lot, because hopefully we'll have a lot of regulators like William Hinman, who thinks that when a system is decentralized, you shouldn't try to regulate it, and lawyers like me who also think that that type of system isn't somehow getting shoehorned into laws that don't work for it. And then what I'd also like to see, though, is that, frankly, and a lot of people won't like this, but if there's just a normal business that is basically just using blockchain as part of its infrastructure, that business doesn't have different regulations or laws that apply to it just because it happens to be using blockchain. And then we'll have these two worlds and they'll intersect with each other, right? The businesses will need a lot more lawyers and they'll need to study the regulations more. And yeah, they'll need to do lobbying and all that stuff, right? Why shouldn't they do lobbying just like any other business? And then the projects that's, a couple of hotshot devs, hanging out in Ibiza or whatever, and launching the cool next smart contract system. Yeah, they'll need a little investment. They might need some lawyer help, like dealing with that, but they'll keep it pretty modest and they'll really have the goal of rapidly decentralizing it. And so there just won't be many legal issues. That's my hope, and that my hope that everyone can get clear on those things. There's a lot of the people in the business category who want to seem like they're the same thing as the devs who are pumping out a smart contract, like out of their basement or something like that. But it's just two different things. And I hope everyone can get clear on what the rules of the road are for different types of players.
So your answer made me think of something else. I noticed I was, doing research on you today, going through your Twitter and listening to some of your interviews. And I pulled a couple quotes, and you're reminding me of one that I forgot to mention, which is somebody said, I don't think you said it, but somebody said it, and you were tweeting about it. Developers are gods, accountable to no one. Now, do you think that that's true? And do you think that that needs to change, or do you think that it's really important that things stay that way in the name of free speech?
So yeah, do I think developers are gods and accountable to no one? That is why I'm in this space, honestly. And I want to become a better coder myself, because I think what this is about, right? Look, if you're just using this system, if you're just using a smart contract, you're using DeFi, whatever, and you're not looking at the code, you might as well be trusting a bank, right? Especially if it was launched recently. Maybe if it's been out there for like a year, and it's open source and it's been very popular, you can trust that, okay, enough other smart people have looked at this. And so it's not really like I'm trusting an intermediary, but I'm just kind of trusting that a lot of smart people have had their eyes on it, and it's open source and so on. So if there was a problem, it would have been found by now. But most people, that's not the situation they're in. Right when something is dropped on Ethereum, they'll start putting tokens in it, right, to try to make money, and they won't look at the code. And even if they did look at the code, they wouldn't understand it because they're not coders, right? They're basically investors, and that I think is a real shame, because I don't think that's why we have this stuff, and I don't think that's any kind of improvement over the existing financial system or existing methods of having self-sovereignty or anything like that. And I do think that really this technology presents an opportunity for a new type of person to emerge, who is more self-empowered, who perhaps is international and moves among many jurisdictions, maybe even is a citizen in many jurisdictions, and uses their technological literacy to immunize themselves to a large extent from coercion by outside parties. And that would be better. That would maximize freedom for everyone. And so I like this idea of the rock star developer and the developer as auteur and that sort of thing. And frankly, I want to become more like that myself, So yeah, I do view it that way for sure.
Yeah. Do you also see it as a free speech issue, like something that has to be this way and must be protected? Otherwise we just lose free speech?
Yes, because you have to preserve, and like I was talking earlier about how Bitcoin benefited from the early cypherpunks. They get it, right? They get that this technology, the whole point of it is to preserve the possibility of civil disobedience, right? If we didn't need the possibility of civil, like if you could go to regulators and get them to like all this stuff, right, and say it was all legal, you wouldn't need it anymore. You could just use more efficient technologies to do the same thing, right? And so, that's for me, that's a key point with all of this, and that it's an inherent tension with the law, that's why you want to be code literate, is so you can civilly disobey, and having the possibility of civil disobedience is what keeps the lawmakers honest, right? Because like you said, if it becomes too expensive to regulate, that's just the same thing as it being legal ultimately.
Well, Gabriel, I really appreciate you coming on the show and answering all these questions. Maybe you can tell the listeners a little bit about where to find you.
Yeah, sure. You can find me on Twitter as @LexNode. That's an underscore between the LEX and the NODE. I also am a partner at a law firm called very traditionally Belcher Smolin and Van Loo LLP. And I have a website called dealninja.law. So you can find me all over the place, and I'm always happy to talk to people.
All right. Thanks so much, man.
Thank you, man. Great chat.